You know, as we look at churches and we talk about how to manage difficulty and transition, and we talk about what it means to kind of help churches through difficult moments, one of the things we've got to think about is how we view church. I grew up, I was a elder's kid and a church secretary's son. What I figured out in that role is that church secretaries have more pull than elders. That's just an interesting little aside. But I also viewed church as this kind of mechanical organization. You came to church, you did stuff, you studied the Bible, you learned how to do things, you do the right things, God blesses you, you do the wrong things, you go to hell. And I really saw the church as an extension of my life, like school or like going to work or going to church. But as we begin to try to understand how churches relate to one another, that model can be really confusing. In my first job right out of college, I became a minister in a church in South Texas, and I was floored how people acted at church. They didn't follow any kind of linear logic why they got upset. The things that caused us to fight didn't seem to fit my model. I could study the Bible all day long, and the things that upset people didn't seem to seem the thing to be that mattered. And so I kind of went back and I began to study how do I lead a bunch of people who seem to be running around like chickens with their heads cut off, who seem to be offended about things I didn't understand, who we tend to have fights in arenas that didn't seem to matter. And I began to study the idea of general systems theory or congregational systems. And what this theory says, to me it's a very kind of biblical concept, is the idea that church is really more an organism than an organization. That we're this living, breathing, functioning organism, and really any organization that has people is this. And if you believe it's a living, breathing organism that kind of has a life of its own, there are certain principles that govern living, breathing organisms that probably still also govern how people act in a religious setting. So what I want to do is look at some of the key ideas in this arena. As we look at the next slide and kind of talk about what are the foundational concepts, what are about 5 key ideas that we need to remember if we're going to look at church as an organism. Key idea number 1 is homeostasis. Homeostasis says any living, breathing organism resists change. That's its natural state. I mean, it's true of our bodies, it's true of church. Looking at me, now I know video puts on 15 pounds, but hey, I'm married to a dietitian, and this is a sad thing. And every once in a while, my wife gets upset, refers to me as a fat boy, and tells me it's time to go on a diet. So when she puts me on a diet, being a male, you know what happens? I'm an overweight male, I go on a diet, you know what happens the first week? I drop like 5 to 10 pounds. Boom, it's just like that. And I'm thinking, hey, this will work, 6 weeks of this, I'm down to fighting weight, I'm in good shape. But what happens the second week? I lose 3 pounds. Third week, I don't lose anything. Fourth week, I gain 3 pounds. Why? My body's natural metabolism says, hey, I don't like change. I'm going to slow this thing down. If it's true in the body, it's equally true in church. The natural state of any religious organization is to fight change. Now, if you understand that on the front end, it becomes easier to deal with conflict. These aren't bad people. These aren't people who don't like you and your leadership. These are people who don't want to be messed with. And you come in with all these bright ideas and doing all this stuff, they're going to kick back. That's all there is to it. There's really only 2 ways you change a church. One is to blow it up. I mean, you can change an organism by, strapping yourself up and going on a jihad and driving the bus and blowing the whole thing up. That's change. The problem with that kind of jihad kind of change is a lot of people die. And sometimes some churches are so sick that's the only kind of change that they understand and they need. They need to just be kind of blown up and start over. But most of the time, you got to take the second approach, which is just to nudge and nudge a little more and nudge a little more. When you do that, people slowly begin to move and move and move. All right? Second concept, differentiation of self. That's the idea, and this is what it means. I care about you without being too connected to you. What? I care about you, but not being dominated by you. I love you as a fellow Christian, but you don't get to determine for me who I am and what I'm about. Now, this is really important for a lot of church leaders. A lot of people became church leaders because they liked being liked. They became ministers or elders, or they became board members, or whatever role you're in, because they like people to like them. But real leaders in these kind of organic environments have to be very differentiated, because the only people you really can change is you. I mean, these are volunteers. You can't force them to do anything. And so you've got to be involved in people's lives, connected to people, encouraging change, but not taking all their burdens on yourself, because they'll drag you down. Third key idea of a general systems idea of church is the identified patient or identified client. That's the black sheep. And this is what it says is the person causing problems in the environment is not necessarily the root cause of the problem. In fact, the identified patient is usually the person least able to handle the stress of the system. Interesting concept. Someone gets upset at church and they start acting out, your first thought is, Mary, just go away, life would be better. That's not necessarily true. It may be that Mary is just the person who sprang a leak first. Kind of using the plumbing illustration, if you get a clog in a plumbing system and the pressure builds up, where is it going to spring a leak? At the weakest joint within the system. You spring a leak at the elbow back there and you're having problems. If you just cut out that elbow, replace that piece of pipe, you don't unclog the problem, you're going to spring a leak somewhere else. Think of your problem people at church as people springing leaks. Now, sometimes the clog is right there. That person needs to go. There's no doubt about it. But many times they're your best friend because they're teaching you what's really going on at church. Third idea, extended family field. Now, what I mean by this is church is one big family, and individuals usually are not influenced just by their own world, but all this extended family around them. Sometimes in small churches, they're literally family, they're relatives. But in larger churches, they have their bodies of influence and their bodies of connection, and the anxiety of one part of the body will tend to flow freely to the other part of the body kind of virally. And they can all influence each other. Even if they never talk, they all know what's going on. And the fifth idea is the emotional triangle, and it's the biggest one, I think, of the bunch. Emotional triangle says that relationships in any organization are a series of interlocking triangles between people. And if they're interlocking, then these triangles will have connectedness all over. And stress on one side of the system will translate all over these interlocking triangles. And that two people under stress will tend to go to a third person to form a triangle and relieve that stress. That's the basic understanding of a triangle. So if two people are fighting, they tend to go to a third party or parties to relieve the stress of their fight. How often has that been you? Now, so if you got these 5 ideas in mind, okay, I want to go a little further talking about emotional triangles a little bit. If we can go to the next slide. There's 7 laws you need to know about these triangles. If you've been sucked into these things or you've been brought into these things, one is not listed, is the most powerful person in the triangle is the party who's been invited in. That's number 1. That third party relationship. That if they've invited you in and you're not a part of their problem, you are a person who has power because you can choose to get in, you can choose to get out. You can choose to involve yourself, how much you involve yourself. You can choose to tell them go do something else. Get rid of that victim mentality that says, oh, I just hate being drug into that stuff. Don't. Remember, we've talked about that task relationship model in other classes. You have a choice. But if you choose to be involved, understand that your choice to be involved in a conflict as a third party is a powerful one. Second, remember this, though, direct change is not always helpful. What I mean by that is, just because you give advice doesn't mean people take it, all right? Just because some of you will have this tendency, you're brought in and you'll listen to one side, listen to the other, and then you'll say, and ministers are terrible about this, you'll say, well, you ought to do this. You should do this, that, or the other. Go, be warm and filled. I gave you good advice, and you sit back in your chair thinking, man, I'm good at this job. The fact remains that people who are directly told to change will listen for about 2 weeks, all right, and then they'll do something else. Direct change doesn't really work. Giving advice doesn't really work. Another thing I'll tell you is trying too hard is counterproductive. Trying to fix their stuff for them. You ever seen people like that at church? They just take everybody's burdens and they just hurt for everybody. And, oh, we need to do something about Mary. Her marriage is bad. Please, minister, please, pastor, save them, you know. And you're going, oh, no. You get that call. The Messiah complex kicks in. You're thinking, da-da-da-da, I'm getting on my white horse. I'm going to solve this family's problem. You get in there and they eat you alive, right? Because here's the deal. You can't fix people's stuff for them. All you can do is help them. Help them learn how to manage their own lives, which we'll talk about in another segment of class, all right? The next idea is the third party ends up with the stress. You got to know that when you get involved in people's stuff, they're going to emotionally throw up on you. That's what they do. They're going to come in and just dump all over you. They're going to feel better and leave all happy. You're going to be sitting there going, man, I love ministry. This is great stuff, you know, and you're just stressed out. It's the nature. You can't help people without taking on their stuff. Going back now to differentiated. How much you take it on is your business. How much you let it bother you is your call, not theirs. Next is triangles interlock. As I mentioned earlier, church is made up of people with all these interlocking triangles. They have all their friends and all their gossip and all their business. You can get mad about that. You can try to pass legislation at church about how people treat each other. The fact remains, people talk and people gossip, and that's how they stay connected. People are going to have their friends. And so when you got a problem with Mary, who's got a problem with John, immediately you got a problem with Fred, Ethel, you know, Ricky, and Desi, or whoever, in this whole thing, because they're all going to be interconnected with one another. So if you're working over here, don't be surprised this stuff is popping up conflictually other places. And you're thinking, wow, that's really unrelated. The youth ministry and the children's ministry and the older people's ministry all have problems at the same time. How ironic, how unusual. Really? You don't mess with one thing without everything else changing. One side is going to be more conflictual than others. One side is going to be always more worked up than the other one. You got to know that the husband or the wife may be way more upset than somebody else. Somebody may really hate the preacher more or less than somebody else. All that's there, you know. And you got to go. And finally, you can only change something you've been invited into. You can only fix problems of people who've asked you either verbally or emotionally to enter their world. You don't get just to come in and tell people what to do. Now, those are some interesting ideas. As we kind of work through this in some of your other projects, I want you to think about the idea of homeostasis. You know, the other things don't change. You got to be differentiated. The concepts of extended family field, the concepts of all these things kind of pulling together, give you the view of church as this living, breathing body. And the way you change it is not getting up and preaching at people, which has its moments. There's an educational side, and that's great, and the Spirit of God moves. I believe that. But why you change it is if you are a differentiated leader who help people be responsible for themselves. You don't take on too much of their pain. You don't try to get them to feel better about themselves all the time and direct all their world, but you're this mentor who walks beside them and helps them to manage their difficulty and gives them opportunity to grow and understands how we relate to one another and connect with one another as a body. Then you'll have a healthier view of conflict.